Hey there friends, David Paulides, CanAm Missing Project, copyrighted edition for our video channel. And we're here with Huck, the executive producer of Huck TV. And she is doing good today. She's very happy. She's one of these Great Pyrenees that loves having her head scratched. And she's a good girl. There was an article today about Great Pyrenees. And when you drive around Montana, oh, big yawn. I know you're sleeping. You're a good girl. And yeah, there's an article up here in Montana about the Pyrenees. And when you drive around up here, you will see them in the fields. And they're protecting the livestock. And it's just totally normal. I mean, it'll be blizzard outside at 20 degrees below, and they're walking around checking on the cattle and the sheep and whatever. And they keep the wolves away and foxes. And some people wrote in the paper about, oh, these ranchers are so cruel. And this one rancher responded back politely, you don't understand. These dogs are bred for the cold. They're tough. There's an area where they can go in and get warm. They have the best food. And it's all true. It's all true. In the other day, it was probably 10 below. Huck wanted to go outside. She went out, laid in the snow for 25 minutes, came in, and then went to sleep. And when she's outside, she's looking around all the time. But that's their job. That's what they're bred for. And that's really what makes her happy. It's a weird thing to understand, but Great Pyrenees are that way. I'm very lucky to have her. She's a great dog. And if you've ever thought about getting a dog, my whole life I've had German Shepherds. These dogs are a lot different. They're way smart. And sometimes they can be a little obstinate, like they want to do it their way. But if you kind of learn how to work around them, they're fine. They're fine. And they'll behave, but they're just different. Okay. This is part of the Amnesia series. And I've got two cases for you that are pretty strange, I gotta say. Oh, I know you're tired. She just let us know she's gonna take a nap. First case is out of Australia. And this fits the T to missing 411 cases. A lot of the cases in Australia matched our cases from the US and Canada. Here's another one. This man is 35 years old. He went missing November 17th, 1949. His name was Steve Smith. That's Steve. Steve was employed by the Australian government. He'd been an employee for 20 years. He started working for him when he was 16 years old. He was a public service clerk. And he lived with his mom and his sister on the outskirts of Sydney in a city called Bondi. He was engaged to a lady, and they'd been engaged for 3 years, and their wedding was imminent. Now, this incident happened November 17th, 1949, at about 6 p.m. Well, the week prior to this, and this is, if you're following these cases, this is going to mean a lot to you. The week prior to this event, Steve had complained of severe headaches. Now, some of you would say, or have said and made it really clear, Dave, you got to pay attention. This is caused by dehydration. Well, except the problem is Steve had worked the whole week before. There would have been no reason for him to be dehydrated. So that dehydration, out the window. Well, on November 17th, 1949, at about 6 p.m., Steve gave his fiancée a ride to Wynyard Station in downtown Sydney, big train station. And he dropped her off for her train. And he said, yeah, as soon as I drop you off, I'm going to head downtown a couple blocks away and book a room for a couple nights for our wedding, which he was excited about. Everyone knew he was excited about it. The fiance got on the train. He was seen walking away. And that night he didn't come home. And his mom called the police and reported Steve as missing. In all of his life, he had never gone missing. He didn't have medical issues. He was a happy soul. He had a great job. He had a great fiancée. Everything in his life was going perfectly. For him to disappear makes no sense to anybody. Well, November 18th, the police came back. They searched his room with the mom's consent. And there was nothing missing. And then the police contacted all of his friends with his mom and his sister's assistance. And in the words of the friends, they were mystified. Because this wasn't part of his persona. His friends and his family stated he was considered extremely reliable, like clockwork. There was no luggage, no clothing missing from his room, and there was no money missing from any of his bank accounts. The family and the fiancé were stunned. Now, this was 1949, folks. Police investigations were decently advanced then. But right away, what triggered me on this is, first of all, it's been about 6 or 7 years now, I did a book tour of the east coast of Australia, Sydney, Brisbane area. And I landed in Sydney. What a beautiful city. Wow. I'll never forget flying into that city. It was gorgeous. And the people, super nice to me. The hardest thing I had in Australia was learning to drive on the left side of the road. Angie saved our bacon a bunch of times. Dave, you're on the wrong side of the road. No, he never got in an accident. But it's weird. It's weird driving. I'm sure when the Australians come over from Australia to the U.S., it's weird for them driving on it over here too. So, but there's a lot of people missing in Australia that match the 411 profile to a T, and a lot missing around Sydney. And that's why this one, I was paying attention to it right away. Well, 38 days pass. Nobody heard anything from Steve. That's odd in and of itself. 39th day. A man walks into the Muswellbrook police station. Said he didn't know who he was. Didn't know how he got there. And he knew he needed help. So, if you go north from Sydney, here's Sydney on the coast. You go north. The quickest way to Muswellbrook is about a 6.5 hour drive and about 260 kilometers. And it's here, north and inland. North and inland, Muswellbrook. Most of the ride is near the coast, and then you cut inland. Okay. Whoa. That was Hawk. We'll blame her for that. So, this man walks into the police station, says he needs help. There's no doubt in my mind that the policeman at this time that had a person walk in on him like this probably didn't know what to do with it. Heck, even today, if I was a policeman and somebody walked in, I wouldn't know what to do with it. But the policeman interviewed him at length. He didn't have any recent memory other than he said that he had walked a lot. He thought maybe he had hitchhiked, didn't know where he was from. He'd been out in the sun a lot. He was apparently sunburned. And the police noted that he looked exhausted and emaciated. And because he didn't know who he was, the police thought that they would give this some publicity in the local press. And they did. And that eventually got down to Sydney. And it made its way along the entire east coast of Australia. These cases in Australia were not normal. Very unusual. Well, Steve had a brother, and he heard about this man in Muswellbrook. And just on the off chance that it could be related to his brother, he decided to make the drive and find out. Now, the description given of this man was a man quite a bit thinner than his brother. He didn't care. He was destined to try to find out what happened to Steve. So he arrives at the police station, and the police say, yeah, we took him to the local hospital, and he's been there for the last several days. And they're trying to see if they can get him better. Not only was he emaciated, but obviously he had no memory who he was or where he was, and he didn't have any ID on him. Remember that. Steve's brother arrived at the hospital, and he did a triple take. He looked at the man in the bed, and he said that this person had lost a lot of weight and was suntanned. And when he started to talk to this man, he said it was like his eyes awakened. The person in the bed was Steve. Steve later stated that when he heard his brother's voice, it's like it awakened him in his soul. Brother and him had a long conversation. Quote, I remember walking over many hills. He said he possibly was hitchhiking, but he couldn't remember that specifically. He said in general he had no idea how he got to Muswellbrook. He says he has no memory of even leaving Sydney. His brother said he knew that Steve needed to be in the hospital. And it was frustrating because as much as he sat and talked to him, he couldn't get him to come around and remember more. Steve did remember that was his brother. They didn't let a lot more of the conversation between the two of them go, other than what I've just told you. Now, Steve stayed in the hospital for approximately a week and then was released back to his brother and stayed with him. The article made no other mention about what happened to Steve in the years afterwards or what happened to his fiancée and his relationship. It's quite a distance to cover between Sydney and Muswellbrook. I don't think it's reasonable in November to do that entirely on foot. I don't think you could do it. But that's just me. But Sydney is a port city. Lots of water. Right on the ocean. I'm just saying. So that's case number 1. Case number 2, it's a doozy. I'm going to try to do the best job I can explaining this, but it can get a little complicated. The man's name was Lawrence Bader, B-A-D-E-R. This is Lawrence, 30 years old. Went missing May 15th, 1957 at 9:30 at night. He was married to a woman named Mary Lou, and he had 2 sons and 1 daughter. He was the son of an Akron, Ohio dentist and a native of Akron, and actually a graduate of Akron University. He was an appliance salesman in Cleveland, which was considered a really good job at the time. One of the things that Lawrence loved to do was fish. And every opportunity he had, he'd go fishing. Now he was in the area of Lakewood and Cleveland because he had a meeting at the appliance store. Afterwards, at about 4 o'clock on May 15th, his wife knew he was going to rent a boat and go out fishing on Lake Erie. And he rented a boat like he did many times at a place called Eddie's Boat Livery in Lakewood. So here's Lake Erie. Here's Lakewood, and that's where he rented the boat. This is Canada on the other side of the line. This is Detroit up here. Now let me just tell you, this area of Lake Erie has some of the most unusual disappearances I've ever documented in any of my books. And now you can add this one to the list. So he rents a boat about 4 o'clock. And if you're a fisherman, you know that the later in the day you go, the better the fishing is. Well, at about 9 o'clock, and that far north, it's still light out, a Coast Guard boat came by and saw him and warned him that the weather was going to turn. It was getting choppy. And he was in a small boat, and they said, you might want to think about coming in. And he says, hey, thank you for checking on me, but I'll be okay. I'm going to a place called Rocky River, and I'll be fine. They checked, and he had his personal life preserver, and he had another one that went with the boat. So he had 2 life preservers, which is right. And that night, Lawrence didn't come home. Now, he lived in Akron, which wasn't very far at all, just south of Lakewood a little bit. Well, his wife called the police, said, hey, my husband, last I knew, he was out on this boat out of Lakewood. Could you please check on him, blah, blah, blah. Well, they did. They couldn't find the boat that night. The next day, May 16th, there was a large search and rescue ran by the Coast Guard and police. And they put a lot of boats out on the water, and they found his boat pretty quickly, right essentially on the beach. It was just rolling up on the sand on Perkins Beach. Would have been just east of where he rented the boat. 1 oar was missing, and 1 blade on the motor had been nicked. Both life preservers were in the boat, and right away, everyone feared he had went overboard. They interviewed the Coast Guard boat that talked to him the night before, and they said, yeah, it was getting rough and choppy, and that's why we told him to come in, but we can't force him to come in, and he seemed to know what he was doing, so we left. The Coast Guard and the police interviewed Lawrence's family. Mary Lou stated, to give some background on Lawrence, that he was a super strong swimmer. And in World War II, he served in the Navy, and in fact, he won awards in the Navy for his swimming ability. That's interesting. But he's missing. And the 17th and the 18th, the following 2 days, the Coast Guard continued the search. Airplanes were used. Lawrence's brother came and aided the searchers. I'm telling you, Lake Erie has a lot of weird disappearances, very similar to this, that I've written about. This one didn't surprise me at all. May 19th, the 3rd day, they had searched hundreds of square miles of Lake Erie, searched the coastline. His car hadn't moved. He was nowhere to be found. His clothing, nothing was missing. The Coast Guard and the police said that they are going to presume he drowned. Now, that's a hard pill to swallow for two sons and a daughter and a wife. And they're missing their husband who's 30 years old. What are you going to do? Well, 3 years later, and in most jurisdictions you have to wait 3 years before a judge will make a determination if somebody is deceased. Well, because they had property, they had kids, they had custody, etc., the wife needed to have the determination made, and the judge made the determination that Lawrence was deceased, and they gave all custody and all rights to the property to Mary Lou. Understandable. And life moved on. The family had to live with the reality that they wouldn't have a dad. Well, many years passed. 8 years passed. February 4th, 1965. An old friend of Lawrence's was at a sports show in Chicago and saw a man that was doing an archery display. Techniques, teaching archery. And the man went by the name of Johnny Johnson. But his friend stared at this man for over an hour. His mannerisms, his voice. In his mind, it was a dead ringer for Lawrence. So he approached the man, started to talk to him, didn't want to scare the man. But it was also odd because Lawrence was an expert archer. So the friend didn't raise awareness to this individual. But John Johnson, if he was Lawrence Bader, would know this friend because they were best friends. But this friend leaves, doesn't say anything, goes to the hotel and immediately calls Lawrence's brothers in Ohio and says, "My gosh, you have to come here. I will swear that this is your brother." The brother said, "Come on. You know, he's been dead for a long time." "No, I'm not kidding you. You got to come here." The brother said, "If you're that adamant, we're coming." So they took the next flight out, and they met his friend, and his friend walked him over to this individual. And this person was very polite. Said his name was John Johnson. He was from Omaha. And he was the director of programming for a TV station in Omaha, their sports department. He had a great job. And the brothers, after spending half a day with this man, convinced him to go with them to the Chicago Police Department to be fingerprinted. And he did. And as they were hanging out together, Johnson said, "You know, I can see the resemblance amongst all three of us, even our voices." And the brother stated that there was one odd thing about all this. Johnny Johnson only had one eye. In the previous 5 years, he lost an eye to cancer. Well, that's very odd. Well, they did go to the police department. They got fingerprinted. And the fingerprints went to the FBI, and they had to get matched, and that took a while. Johnson went back to Omaha and agreed to go through a series of tests at a hospital. At the time he was married, he had 2 kids. He got remarried. Well, he didn't know he got remarried, but he got married and he had 2 kids. Brothers talked to him about his life as a appliance salesman and had a family and in Akron, and they said it was just like blank stares. But now stop for a second. If you were thinking that Johnny Johnson was faking it, then why would he agree to go get fingerprinted? Because anybody faking it would know that those fingerprints are coming back from the War Department as a match to Lawrence Bader, because he knew he was in the military. This is if he was faking the whole thing. But then he came back and he realized something might be wrong. So he went through a series of tests at an Omaha hospital. Well, on February 18th, the fingerprints positively came back, IDing Johnson as Bader. On March 12th, the brothers went back out to Omaha, and they spent a series of time with Lawrence. They were later interviewed, and they said, "We are 100% convinced that this man has no memory of his past at all." And they said it was frustrating. They couldn't get anything to click in, but that this man realized something was wrong. Well, the wife he was married to now heard about all this, and she actually got an annulment of their marriage and custody of their 2 kids. Now, if you were Johnny Johnson, what a blow to your life. Everything's going along smooth, you think. You go to a sports show and all of a sudden everything changes. You lose your wife, you lose your family. He lost his job at the sports station. The doctors in Omaha stated that he had one of the most severe cases of amnesia they'd ever seen. When he first came to Omaha, he told his brothers that one of the first jobs he can remember having is as a bartender. He says he wasn't sure why he got a job as a bartender. Wasn't sure how he even got it, but he did. Well, after he lost his job at the station, he got a job again as a bartender. In all the articles I read, Johnny Johnson never fully regained his memory. He had reconciled that he must be Lawrence Bader, and those must be his brothers. But he stayed in Omaha. That was something I just didn't understand. He had a very near perfect life in Omaha until this all started to crumble. There was never an insinuation that this was phony or he was faking or that it was a hoax. And the people in Omaha loved him because of his notoriety on the sports station. And maybe that was that comfortable feeling in his life that he was unwilling to leave, because the memory that he had for his entire life centered on Omaha. One thing that I would have loved to have interviewed his second wife, if Johnny Johnson was only Johnny Johnson in his mind, and this wasn't hoaxed, why would his wife leave him and take him away from his kids? It's one of those $1 million questions in this story that never was fully answered. It was also never answered if he ever spoke to his first wife again. Now remember, his brothers stated, both brothers stated, they were 100% convinced he wasn't hoaxing anything, and he had no memory of his prior life. Friends, how many times are you going to hear a story about a person on a boat disappearing, getting amnesia, and forgetting about the first part of their life? How many times are you going to hear that? That's why I'm stunned that this series hasn't really caught on. Because nobody I've ever met has ever talked about this or connected the dots how I have. It's stunning to me. I know some of you really are intrigued, and thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you very much for being here. And in the future, I've got more unreal stories to come. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you. And remember, February 10th, it's coming up. I'm going to be at Phoenix MUFON. Phoenix MUFON. If you Google Phoenix MUFON, you'll see I'm going to be at one of the best facilities in Phoenix, speaking to a capacity crowd. I hope you're there. In the meantime, this is the kindness revolution. Be nice to people. Paulides out.